Let's begin with his dinner parties. Caligula loved inviting high-ranking senators and their wives to these lavish feasts, which is extra thrilling when you remember Caligula absolutely despised the Roman Senate. Mid-meal, he would get up and slowly walk behind the seated wives, inspecting them in silence like livestock at an auction. If one caught his eye, he'd grab her by the hair, yank her head back so he could get a better look at her face. You look better from this angle. Pity your husband never figured that out. He'd take her into a private room while the dinner continued without pause. Don't worry, I'll return her. I'm not a barbarian. The husband was forced to sit at the table, eating and drinking, knowing exactly what was happening just a few feet away. And it didn't even end there. When Caligula eventually came back to the table with the woman, he'd casually critique her performance in front of everyone, especially her husband, going into explicit detail, praising what he liked, complaining about what he didn't. Decent, enthusiastic, but clearly undertrained. That's on you. Now, who's next? Let's not waste the evening. His contempt for the Senate didn't stop at dinner table humiliation. Sometimes Caligula liked to take his chariot out for a high-speed joyride through the streets of Rome. The catch was that he never rode alone. He'd force Roman senators, old men with soft bodies, to put on their full ceremonial robes and run alongside him for miles. Keep up, the people expect a show! As the emperor lounged in his golden chariot, these elderly politicians were forced to sprint through the dust and heat, gasping for air while the public watched. And whenever he'd stop for a break, he'd make them kiss his feet. There, that's the closest you'll get to power today. Alright, stretch if you need to. We're not done. Let's talk about the horse. Caligula had a favorite stallion named Incitatus, and this wasn't some dusty farm animal tied to a fence post behind the palace. No, Incitatus lived in a stable made of solid marble. He wore a collar crusted with precious jewels. He even had his own house, fully staffed with servants, whose actual job was to host guests on behalf of a horse. Caligula would invite Incitatus to formal dinner parties, along with the senators, of course, and seat him like a guest of honor, feed him golden barley, and raise drinking toasts to his health, while grown men in togas pretended this was normal. He listens. He doesn't interrupt. He doesn't plot. Truly exceptional. But then came the real insult, when Caligula announced his intention to appoint his horse as consul, the highest political office in the entire Roman Empire. Any objections? No? Excellent. He's already more decisive than you. This one time, during a Roman sacrifice ritual, normally the emperor would stand beside a sacred bull, while a cult priest, called a popa, waited nearby holding a massive wooden mallet, ready to crack the animal's skull on command. But this time, standing there beside the bull is Caligula, eyes lit up with a sudden inspiration. As the popa raised the mallet to strike the bull, wait a minute, I have a better idea. Caligula suddenly snatched it out of his hands. Everyone assumed they were about to witness a dramatic display of imperial strength against the cow. Watch closely, this part's important. Instead, Caligula turned around and smashed the mallet straight into the popa's skull. The priest dropped dead instantly, his blood spilling across an altar that had been prepared for a cow. Oh, that worked better than I expected. Don't just stand there, you're making it awkward. Alright, reset the altar. Another time, on a blistering afternoon during the gladiatorial games, Rome's favorite excuse to clap while people died, the crowd showed up expecting the usual lineup. Criminals, prisoners, someone officially labeled deserving, so everyone could feel morally hydrated while the lions did their thing. But there was a problem. They ran out of condemned prisoners before the lions were done eating. Did we miscount? Someone always miscounts. The cages sat empty. The beasts paced. That's unfortunate. They're clearly still hungry. The crowd sat confused, because surely the emperor would just end the show early like a normal human being. Unfortunately, the man in charge was Caligula. Relax, I won't waste your afternoon. Instead of calling it off, he pointed into the stands. You, and that whole section. You're all part of the show now. Ordered his guards to seize an entire section of spectators, ordinary Roman citizens who had paid for seats, brought snacks, and absolutely did not plan on becoming part of the program. They were dragged screaming down into the arena, suddenly promoted from audience to livestock. And just to make sure the entertainment stayed clean and uninterrupted, Caligula ordered their tongues cut out before they were thrown to the starving lions. See? Much better. Now, before you go writing Caligula off as a completely heartless monster, stop. He did love people. Specifically, his 3 sisters. Loved them passionately, intensely, physically, in ways that made everyone else in the room stare at the floor and pretend sandals were fascinating. Stop looking away. It's rude. Caligula reportedly maintained incestuous relationships with all 3 of his sisters. His obsession centered most intensely on his middle sister, Julia Drusilla. She wasn't just family. She was the emotional, load-bearing wall of his psyche. She understands me. The rest of you just endure me." So when she suddenly died of illness, whatever restraint Caligula had left evaporated on the spot. Fix it. That's not acceptable. His grief detonated. He declared a period of justitium, effectively freezing normal life across Rome. During this time, it became a capital crime to laugh, to bathe, or even dine with your family. Most Roman emperors were perfectly satisfied being called emperor, which, to be clear, already meant you could ruin millions of lives with a gesture. But for Caligula, ruling the known world wasn't enough. He wanted the heavens to acknowledge him personally. So he started small, ordered the heads of statues of famous gods, including Jupiter himself, to be chopped off and replaced with stone replicas of his own face. He didn't just want to be like a god, he claimed he was one. Stop saying "as if," I am. He then began spending hours in the temple of Castor and Pollux, seating himself between the statues of the twin gods and just waiting for citizens to come and worship him. Do they usually take this long? And it got worse. Caligula claimed to hold secret late-night conversations with the moon and Jupiter. Sometimes he whispered to Jupiter's statue like they were old friends sharing gossip. "Between us, they like me better." Other times he screamed at it, openly threatening the king of the gods for stealing his thunder. The final straw was when he demanded that a massive golden statue of himself be installed inside the temple in Jerusalem, a move so violently disrespectful that it nearly triggered a full-scale rebellion. Why is this controversial? I'm being generous. Now let's talk about Caligula's military genius. At one point, Caligula assembled a massive Roman army for what was supposed to be a grand invasion of Britain. But when the legions reached the edge of the English Channel, the emperor gave an order that snapped every remaining brain cell in half. Instead of boarding ships to cross the water, Caligula commanded his troops to draw their swords and charge into the waves. Why? He was declaring war on Neptune, the god of the sea. As thousands of Roman soldiers stood waist-deep in freezing water, hacking at waves, stabbing surf, Caligula stood on the shore, claiming a total military victory over the ocean itself. But the absurdity didn't stop there. He ordered his men to fill their helmets with seashells, proudly labeling them spoils of war, taken from the conquered sea. Don't argue, it's more than you usually earn. And just to really seal the deal, Caligula planned a full military triumph, Rome's highest honor, to celebrate his decisive victory over the waves. The sea will think twice next time. Caligula was obsessed with presenting himself as a living god, which unfortunately made his actual physical flaws a matter of life and death. He was young, tall, and pale enough to look properly divine from a distance, but up close, reality ruined everything. His hair was receding aggressively from the top of his head, while being exceptionally hairy across the rest of his body. To Caligula, this wasn't just embarrassing, it was treason, so he made it a capital crime for anyone to look down on him from a higher level as he passed through the city. Balcony, terrace, staircase, it didn't matter. If your eyes were positioned above the emperor's thinning hairline, you were assumed to be mocking it on purpose. Guards were stationed specifically to enforce this rule, making sure no one ever had a downward angle on the divine bald spot. Lower your head. Lower. Lower. That's good. But the strangest taboo of all was a single word. Goat. Because of his hairy torso and spindly legs, Caligula lived in mortal fear of being compared to a goat, so he banned the word entirely in his presence. Say goat in any context, and it was treated as a coded jab at the emperor's appearance. People who slipped up, or were overheard making the comparison, were often dragged away to the dungeons or tossed into the arena. Let's rewind to when Caligula first became emperor, back when he was fresh, popular, and surrounded by people who had very literally kept him alive long enough to wear the crown. Within a year, he had murdered every single one of them. First up was Tiberius Gemellus, Caligula's own cousin and the co-heir to the throne. To keep things looking warm and wholesome, Caligula initially adopted him. "You're safe now. We're family." Then, once everyone relaxed, he accused the teenager of plotting against him and forced the boy to commit suicide. Next was his father-in-law, Marcus Silanus, who had the misfortune of being the rational voice in the room. Caligula claimed Silanus was secretly hoping for his death so he could take the throne. "I don't have time for a trial, you understand." He forced the old man to take a razor and cut his own throat. Then came the biggest betrayal of all, Macro, the head of the Praetorian Guard. This was the very man who had put Caligula on the throne, which meant Caligula could never look at him without feeling like he owed him everything. You always think you're helping, that's the problem. He stripped Macro of his command and forced both him and his wife to take their own lives. Years earlier, a famous astrologer had predicted that Caligula had no more chance of becoming emperor than of riding a horse across the Gulf of Baiae. He said that? Interesting. A normal person would ignore it, knowing the crossing is a perfectly measurable 3 miles long. A slightly unwell person would brood about it. Caligula decided it was time to prove a dead man wrong. Alright, let's settle this. He didn't just build a bridge. He paralyzed the Roman economy to do it. He ordered his engineers to seize every merchant ship they could find, effectively halting the empire's grain supply. Stop asking why, start tying ropes. These hundreds of ships were anchored in a double line stretching over 3 miles across the open sea. Then they covered the ships with dirt and stone and paved the whole thing over to look like a proper Roman road. Make it look permanent. I want him to see it. And Caligula didn't just stroll across it like a tourist. To properly celebrate his conquest of the sea, he put on the breastplate of Alexander the Great, which he had looted from Alexander's tomb. Trust me, he'd appreciate this. We're very similar. He spent 2 days charging back and forth across the bridge on his horse, followed by his entire army in a mock invasion. Are you watching, you senile piece of shit? Once the performance was over, the bridge was dismantled immediately. The ships were released. The treasury was empty. Thousands of tons of food never reached Rome, leading to a massive famine. Yes, but on the bright side, he was wrong. Caligula's obsession with massive, unnecessary projects didn't stop with starving cities and bridges to nowhere. Tucked away in the Alban Hills sat Lake Nemi, a small, sacred body of water known as the Mirror of Diana. To most Romans, it was a quiet, religious site devoted to Diana. To Caligula, it was the perfect spot for the most expensive pool party in human history. Diana won't mind. She's never complained to me. Caligula commissioned 2 ships so absurdly large and over-engineered they had no business existing on a tiny lake. These weren't warships either. They were floating luxury villas, each measuring over 230 feet long, built purely to flex on water that didn't ask for this. The decks were paved with multicolored marble, actual marble, on a boat. They were heated with complex underfloor furnace systems, because apparently hypothermia was a concern while floating on a pond in Italy. Fresh water ran through lead pipes. Bronze animal head fountains spat water on command. Make them roar. Water should feel intimidated. They even had small orchards, with fruit trees and vines growing on board. He'd spend days lounging on these vessels, reclining in silk-curtained rooms, while slaves rowed him back and forth across a lake so small he could have walked around it in an hour. Take me that way. Now back. By the end of his reign, Caligula had completely burned through the massive imperial treasury. The money was gone, vaporized. So, like any desperate ruler with unlimited authority and zero impulse control, he came up with a solution that was both innovative and deeply unhinged. He turned the imperial palace on Palatine Hill into a red light district. Caligula converted an entire wing of the palace into a literal brothel, partitioning off rooms and filling them with the wives and daughters of Rome's most respected noble families. Curtains here, privacy is important, and he didn't even try to hide the operation. Caligula marketed it. He sent criers into the streets to invite the public to the palace, and he personally stood at the entrance, collecting admission fees like a nightclub doorman. Hey, no sandals inside, pal. This is a classy establishment. If you didn't have enough money to participate, no problem. Caligula offered loans, because nothing says imperial dignity like financing your own humiliation. In just 4 years, Caligula had managed the rare feat of terrorizing everyone in Rome. Senators, citizens, priests, soldiers, and even his own bodyguards. When you bully an entire empire equally, eventually someone stops laughing and starts sharpening. That someone was Cassius Chaerea, a senior officer in the Praetorian Guard, the emperor's elite military unit. For years, Caligula had singled Chaerea out for relentless humiliation, mocking his high-pitched voice and calling him effeminate in front of other soldiers. Every night, when Chaerea performed his duty and asked for the watchword, Caligula made it worse. Instead of a proper military password, he'd give him something obscene or insulting and force him to repeat it aloud to the troops. You know the ritual. Say it.
Ass butt.
Again, for the men in the back.
Ass butt.
Same time tomorrow, don't forget. Eventually, the joke ran out. On the last day of the Palatine Games, Caligula left the festivities and headed back toward the palace baths, cutting through a narrow, secluded underground corridor beneath the palace. Chaerea and a group of conspirators were already waiting in the shadows. As Caligula approached, Chaerea stepped forward and drove his sword straight into the emperor's neck. As Caligula collapsed, choking and flailing, he reportedly cried out, "I am still alive!" To which the assassins replied, with 30 more stabs. So what did you learn today? Hopefully nothing useful. Just don't be an asshole if you're ever given unchecked authority.